Warning! This episode may cause blindness, deafness, even paralysis.
It may leave you feeling frightened, perhaps even suffering from unprecedented levels of exhaustion, and even cause complete incapacitation.
But if you accept these conditions, you may find this episode quite charming.
So stay tuned. Greetings, adventurers. My name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes.
On today's episode, we're taking a look at the various conditions found in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
Yeah, now the status conditions are a handy rules shorthand, or a keyword, that many different effects, spells, and other player and monster abilities refer to, and they cause negative or sometimes positive effects upon your characters.
And it's important to know exactly what these are, and more importantly, if you're having one applied to your character, how long they're going to last.
And we're going to share with you some of our tips and tricks for keeping track of these conditions and clear up some common confusion that people run into with what these conditions actually do.
So let's take a look.
Now, Kelly, there's about a dozen or more different conditions that happen in Dungeons & Dragons. But in the heat of battle, how can we actually stay on top of all that?
Well, there's a number of different ways that we're going to look at today on how to keep track of conditions. Some of our favorite methods we've actually put out on the table here, which include using beads or tokens. This is very handy if you are using a map and minis, because then you can actually place the token next to the mini that it is applied to give you a visual representation of what is happening with that mini.
Yeah, some people just like to use dice, and they'll just use the face of the dice and place it beside the miniature. Of course, at many craft stores, you can find colored beads, and usually you can get a huge tube of these for only a couple dollars. And as long as you keep track of which color represents which effect, they're a great way to just put right down on the map and mark either the center of an effect or put beside a miniature to illustrate which ones are affected by the condition.
Yeah, and if you need to, you can just write on a scrap piece of paper exactly what all the colors mean to you, and you can switch them up really day to day depending on what's going on in your game.
Now, we also like the various condition tokens that are made by Gale Force 9. These cost about $10 or $15 for a packet of them, and they have nice little artwork on them. And they mark the conditions and are dry erasable, so you can actually write on the specifics of the effect. These kind of tokens are used for various different miniatures games, and you can find different styles of them, but these are the official Dungeons & Dragons ones for 5th edition. Some people also use things like coins or other markers, and some companies and players will also print out cards that have the rules text of the condition and pass that to the player. That's really useful if you're not playing with a grid or miniatures as a way of tracking the conditions too.
Yeah, but some players tend to forget to look down at the card that's in their hand, so a visual representation, if you have that option on the board, is much better. Or if you want to be really cool like my party does, they like to use pieces of candy, and then when the effect is done, they eat the candy.
That's really cute. Now, the other thing with keeping track of the rules for conditions themselves is many Dungeon Master screens have all the conditions summarized for you as the DM in the middle of the screen itself. So if you're getting the Dungeon Master screen Reincarnated, all the conditions and their effects are listed right there. So you have that handy rules reference. And the conditions are all kept in an appendix at the back of the player's handbook. So they're all in one place. That said, there's a few things that we want to clarify with a couple of different conditions that come up a lot in our games, because even though the rules are pretty short for each condition, there's still a couple points of confusion about what's actually happening with them. So let's jump into that.
So the first condition we're going to be talking about today is blinded, which means you can't see.
Yeah, blinded has a few mechanical things that always happen. If you're blinded, you have disadvantage on attack rolls, and attacks made against you also have advantage. So it's a pretty brutal condition, both defensively and offensively. And
it can be really, really intense if you have it happen to you, but also keep in mind that there are some spells like blindness, deafness that can be very handy if you keep in mind how much of an effect blindness actually has on the battlefield.
Now, one of the difficult things about blindness is that it's often uncertain about, okay, well, all this is existing in my imagination. I still see the miniatures on the grid. It's not like you're going to break out a blindfold and blindfold me at the table while I'm playing. So it can be difficult to get into the imaginative sense of what your character can and cannot see when they're blinded and role play that appropriately. This is why the rules still give you disadvantage on your attack rolls to make sure that you're still suffering some sort of penalty. In play, it's useful to think about really critically like what the character would know is around them. I like to imagine that a blinded character still has a proprioceptive sense of like what's within about 5 feet of them, but in other cases they might not be able to see that dangerous ledge in front of them or read the writing on a wall.
So next we have Charmed, and Charmed is a very interesting condition because a lot of people get confused with the text here.
Yeah, the Charmed condition on its own only does 2 things. When you're charmed, you can't attack or harm the creature that charmed you, and you also, the creature that charmed you has advantage on any check made to interact socially with that creature. What's confusing here is that the charmed condition, in many of the rules, spells, and other effects that cause it, is often attached to another effect. This effect is not the charmed part, so people tend to think that charm means you're mind controlled. That's just because charm is often regularly associated with mind control effects. But charmed on its own does not mean you gain control of the creature that you're charming.
Yeah, so social interactions, yeah, you can be better at those against a charmed character, but you do not automatically gain full control of that charmed creature.
Yeah, that creature doesn't even necessarily view you as its best friend. It wouldn't forget that you're an enemy.
It just doesn't want to hurt you.
It just doesn't want to hurt you right now, and it's open and receptive to your persuasion and deception checks.
A lot of times, a creature can actually know when it has a charm spell cast on it.
Yeah, and that's really, really deadly. If you use, like, Charm Person on somebody, then they know that you charmed them afterwards, and they're going to be really mad.
Yeah. So next up we have Deafened, which is a little bit of an interesting one because there's not a lot of practical uses in game mechanics. It's more of a role-playing condition.
Yeah, it used to be that if you were deafened, you would have, like, and you were trying to cast a spell with verbal components, you might have a penalty to do that, but that doesn't exist in D&D 5th edition. Being deafened doesn't prevent you from doing anything, it just prevents you from hearing other people.
One of the main things I could see being a practical use of deafening somebody is if you deafen somebody using like a spell or something, to stealth around them.
Yeah, and that's really, really useful if you can't hear somebody, they can't detect you, right? So a creature could be deafened, for instance, if it's in the area of a silent spell, right? And that makes it really, really easy for other people to sneak around them.
So next up we have exhaustion, which is probably one of the more elaborate conditions that can happen at the game table because it has 6 different levels to it.
Yeah, and the exhaustion mechanic is actually really, really cool. Because, first of all, once you become exhausted, in most cases that exhaustion lasts until you're able to take a rest of some kind. And you do have to have access to food and drink in order to overcome that exhaustion.
Now, exhaustion does stack, so every time you hit a new level of exhaustion, you're still affected by all the previous levels as well.
Yeah, it's cumulative. So even though the first level of exhaustion, you only suffer from disadvantage on ability checks, once you build up to level 2 and 3 exhaustion and start having disadvantage on your attack rolls and your speed gets halved, things get really, really worse up until level 6 exhaustion, where you just flat out die.
Yeah. That can be rough. I like to use exhaustion for long journeys. If, as a DM, if my players are going through maybe a desert landscape or Arctic landscape or a long adventure where they have limited food and water, foraging comes into play, this is where exhaustion is going to play a key role.
Yeah, anytime where your players are like, we're going to physically exert ourselves for days on end, exhaustion should be something coming up as a DM. And because it's really baked into a lot of the rules for wilderness survival and exploration. So DMs, be aware of all the ways that exhaustion can come up, because it's actually a great mechanic. I find that it's really nicely graded, and I actually wish that D&D 5e used the exhaustion mechanic in other places to reflect a condition that gets worse as it progresses, but one that can also be gradually recovered from in steps. It's a really, really nice mechanic, even if it is a little bit more complex than some of the other conditions.
I do find that my players actually enjoy having that as almost a draw for them to need to think more about the choices that they make while they're traveling from point A to point B.
Yeah, and actually, even like level 1 exhaustion imposing disadvantage on your ability and skill checks. I remember one game where, like, Kelly, your character didn't sleep at all last night, and your monk wanted to jump across all these buildings and was making all their athletics and acrobatics checks with disadvantage. And
it was intimidating. I wish I had slept better.
Yeah, exactly. Get a good night's rest.
The next condition we're going to be talking about is Frightened.
Now, Frightened comes up a lot with monster abilities, quite frequently with most dragons who have a frightful presence power. And Frightened means that you cannot move towards the target of your fear, and you have disadvantage on attack rolls while you can see whatever you're afraid of. A lot of times the Frightened condition is also accompanied by another rider, not unlike the Charmed condition, where you have that forces you to either spend your action or your movement to flee away from whatever you're afraid of. But that's not actually a required part of the Frightened condition.
Yeah, a lot of people make that mistake and assume that if you are under the condition of being frightened, that you automatically have to spend your entire turn running away from the source of your fear. But that's only if it specifically says that.
Yeah, and also I think Frightened is one of the conditions that the most player character classes get resistance or immunity to. Pretty helpful to have a paladin nearby with like an aura of courage. I think even raging barbarians, depending on their specialization, get immunity to fear as well.
Yeah. Next up, we're talking about grappled.
Grab stuff.
How to grab stuff. How to grab things, throw it down.
Yeah, so grappled is a condition that is usually applied by the grab action. So one creature reaches out to grab, and then it can be broken with some athletics or acrobatics checks. But the grappled condition can also be broken if whatever creature is grabbing you or you are pushed away from each other. So as soon as you're out of the reach of whatever's grabbing onto you, the grabbed condition ends. What's interesting about being grabbed is, while your speed is reduced to 0, you don't have any other penalties. You can still attack that creature normally. But because your speed is reduced to 0, I'm pretty sure that if you're knocked prone, you can't now stand up from prone, right? Because you have no speed to spend.
Yeah. Isn't there also, there's a lot of times where when you grapple a creature, or when a creature in like the monster manual grapples you, it will also say that you are now restrained.
Yeah, that's really, really common for monsters that many monsters like ropers will have a tentacle or a grab attack that their attack deals damage, then grapples you, and simultaneously imposes the restrained condition. So this is like 3 things all happening at the same time, but those are all different components. So the attack might hit and deal damage, but the grapple might not take, and if the grapple doesn't take, then the restrained condition does not occur.
Next up, we're talking about Incapacitated, which is a pretty big one.
Yeah, the reason why Incapacitated is an important condition is because many of the other conditions that we're going to talk about later are going to refer back to the incapacitated condition as a component. So you'll get conditions that say you're incapacitated. And basically all incapacitation means is that you can't take actions or reactions. Nothing else applies to this, but there's a few interesting implications for that. Because if you're incapacitated, you can't concentrate on a spell.
That's deadly.
Yeah.
So yeah, any spellcaster who gets incapacitated, and this is good for both the DM to know and the players. If you're fighting a rival spellcaster and you have an ability that can incapacitate them and they're focusing on a spell that's really doing a lot of damage, that's going to be a great move to incapacitate them and stop that spell.
Yeah, and a lot of other class abilities or features stop working if you're incapacitated for whatever reason. So be aware that many powers and class features will say this feature does not work if you are incapacitated. And the reason being is that other conditions then refer back to that. Of course, if you're only incapacitated, you can still move and you can still speak. You just cannot take actions or reactions, and of course you also can't take bonus actions because you can't take actions, period.
Next up we have invisibility. So that one, you turn invisible. Nobody can see you, but that doesn't mean they can't find you.
Yeah, when you're invisible, you have advantage on attacks against creatures that can't see you, and you also have advantage on any stealth checks you might make. But if you don't actually take the hide action, your position is not hidden from everyone else. It's assumed that you're still making enough noise, or that you leave enough traces of your passage that other creatures can still figure out approximately where you are, and they can still attack you. But they do have disadvantage on their attacks.
Frodo did not take the hide action when he put the ring on in the mountain and Gollum jumped on him.
Yeah, that's a really great example. Gollum still was able to tell where Frodo was.
Looked for the footprints and was like, I'm going to jump here.
Yep. And that's really all it takes to find an invisible creature that isn't actually trying to hide. At the same time, be aware that there's many different class abilities and spells that specifically require you to be able to see your target. So those will be turned off if you're trying to use them against an invisible creature. A really great example of this is all of a beholder's eye rays require that beholder to be able to see its target. So if you turn invisible, you can't be targeted by a beholder's eye rays whatsoever.
But then if it uses its middle eye, it can see you. But then it can't shoot you.
Yeah, because you're in the anti-magic cone, so it can see you, but it can't shoot you. And then if it now can't see you, it can't shoot you.
So you can make a really hilarious scenario with a beholder if you want. So what if you're paralyzed?
This is a really bad one.
Yeah, if you're paralyzed, it's not going to look good for you. It's a rough shape to be in.
This is the first of the conditions that refers back to being incapacitated. Not only are you incapacitated when you're paralyzed, though, your speed is reduced to 0, and there's an even worse rider attached to the whole thing, in the form of any creature within 5 feet of you that attacks you while you're paralyzed. If that attack hits, you are automatically critically hit instead.
Ouch. If you attack a paralyzed creature, it doesn't automatically hit. You still have to roll to hit.
You do have advantage.
You do have advantage. But maybe you're just really bad at swinging that sword.
It reflects the fact that the creature still might be wearing armor or have some sort of natural defenses. So even though, like, if you paralyze a guy in plate armor, you still have to punch through the plate armor.
I guess that makes more sense than what I was imagining, where you're just like, oh no, I'm not very good at aiming.
The next condition we're looking at is the petrified condition. A very rare one, but a deadly one at that.
Medusa, turning people into stone.
Flesh to stone, the spell.
Yeah, those...
Or basilisks.
Basilisks.
Gorgons. Beholders do it too.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
So, when you're petrified, it's a little bit different. You're actually turning into a different substance, usually a solid substance like stone.
Although sometimes I could reflavor and imagine a creature that would, like, turn you into solid gold or something like that. Like, I often like to flavor that.
I was also imagining, like, a druid turning somebody just into a tree, and now you're made of wood, and you're just this wood thing.
That would be cool. Yeah.
Yeah, but basically, you get incapacitated.
You can't move or speak, and you're not aware of your surroundings. You cease aging, and your weight increases by 10.
And you become immune to poison and disease. However, if you already have a disease or the poison effect on you, it is kind of on pause. It doesn't disappear, but it's just on pause until you come out. Yeah,
and you gain resistance to all damage, as well as, but on the flip side, you're not aware of your surroundings, so attacks against you have advantage, and you fail at all your strength and dexterity saving throws. And you get this really bad thing where if someone comes up to you and snaps off a piece of your body, when you get turned back into a not statue, then you're kind of missing that body part now. Pretty brutal. Usually petrification, if it's rendered permanent, you need to spell like greater restoration in order to undo it. Petrification is a pretty terrible thing to have happen to your character because at that point you're not dead, so you can't be raised from the dead. So if you really want to get rid of someone forever, you can turn them to stone and then disintegrate their statue because they're not technically dead. But good luck finding anything left of them.
Oh boy.
Poison is a really simple one. You just have disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks, but not saving throws.
Interesting.
We have a bit of a favorite way of using the poison condition in our games, though, for drinking booze.
Yes.
And simulating the effects of drinking too much alcohol, which is pretty appropriate because dwarves get advantage on their saving throws, reflecting the dwarven alcohol tolerance.
Next up, we have prone, which is pretty straightforward. If you're prone, you're not standing up, boop, you're down. You can be knocked prone, or you can choose to go prone. Going prone is free,
but
standing up from prone
costs half your
movement.
Prone is if someone's right beside you when they attack you, they have advantage against you when you're prone. Being prone does not prevent you from using your weapons or making attacks. Sometimes it may be appropriate to be like, if you're trying to use a longbow while you're prone, that attack might have disadvantage.
Although a very important fact that I sometimes forget is when you're prone, melee attacks have advantage on you, but ranged attacks have disadvantage on you.
Provided that ranged attacker is further than 5 feet away. You can run up to somebody who's prone and shoot them, and you don't have disadvantage.
Yeah, but if you're being attacked by volleys of arrows, it's not a bad idea to drop prone and crawl your way.
Yeah, army crawl style.
Yeah. So earlier when we mentioned grappled, we talked about how that sometimes results in being restrained. So the next condition we're going to talk about is restrained.
Yeah, when you're restrained, your speed becomes 0, and you can't benefit from anything that would increase your speed. So you're locked in place. Furthermore, you have disadvantage on attack rolls and dexterity saving throws, as well as attacks made against you have advantage. Kind of handy. I think it's a good strategy for using a spell to restrain a creature and then hitting them with fireball or something that they need a dexterity saving throw against. It's a great 1-2 combo.
We have stunned, which I really like to do as a player, but I really hate to happen to me as a player as well.
The interesting thing is that the stunned condition is the same as the paralyzed condition, except Paralyzed has that additional rider that you get crit automatically, but Stunned does not. And you can actually speak, but only falteringly when you're stunned.
As a DM, I find that you want to be careful stunning your party.
Yeah, losing your entire turn because you're stunned, paralyzed, or unconscious is a pretty boring way to spend your turn. So the creme de la creme of status conditions, and probably the most deadly one short of petrification, is unconsciousness. Unconsciousness is the step above paralysis, if you want to gradiate them, because with this one, again, you're incapacitated, you can't move, you can't speak, and you're not even aware of your surroundings.
You also drop prone and drop whatever you're holding as well.
Yeah, this is the only condition where this actually happens. When you're stunned or paralyzed, you don't actually fall prone, and you don't drop whatever you were holding. Like with being paralyzed, any attack roll made by a creature within 5 feet of you is automatically a critical hit. Most of the time that you go unconscious because you're dying. Which also means that anyone that comes up to you and hits you with a melee attack causes you to fail 2 death saving throws. So if you are rendered unconscious by a spell like Sleep or Eye Bite, you don't have to worry about that. But most of the time the unconscious condition is going to come up because a creature is actually at death's door and is making death saving throws.
So be very careful of that, and if you have a team member who is falling down and being knocked unconscious and is at death's door, try to protect them.
So that's a real quick overview of the various status conditions that can happen to your character in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition.
We hope that this helps out with just understanding all the various things that can happen to your character or that you can do to your enemies.
And I personally hope they never happen to you, but they probably will. So you'll be glad to know exactly what kind of conditions are afflicting your character.
For you DMs out there who are looking for a very handy reference to all of these conditions, you can find them on the DM screen Reincarnated, which we have a video for right over here.
And of course, you'll be using many of these conditions in combat, so check out our great guide on all the actions you can take while you're not incapacitated in combat, right over here.
Please subscribe to our channel so that you never miss an episode.
And thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time
In the dungeon.